For many of us, the music of Beethoven has been the source of peak musical experiences. His music was what we needed for life's most exalted and most despairing moments. It celebrated the brotherhood of man when the Berlin Wall came down, and it whispered consolation at the death of a loved one. To understand the modern musical world we live in, Beethoven is still the principal figure even 200 years after his death. It's a tall order to take in the broad historic developments that are reflected in Beethoven's life and music. Although he was committed to the Enlightenment and to classical Viennese musical values, his rebellious temperament led him to set in motion the radical energy of Romanticism. The achievement of the Enlightenment had been to recognize that individuals had reason and had rights. Over time, as these individuals became more self-absorbed, the age of Romanticism set in, and with it the possibility that individuals, through idealism and struggle, could fulfill their aspirations. Beethoven's life became the archetypal example of this phenomenon, the lonely artist hero producing works of awe-inspiring greatness through suffering. Because of Beethoven's archetypal status, it's hard to imagine him as a living person. Most of these portraits were painted during his lifetime. We know from his contemporaries that Beethoven was considered a fairly short man at 5 feet 4 inches. He had a stocky, muscular body, a big head, a ruddy complexion pockmarked from smallpox, and dark, expressive eyes. His curly hair was unruly, and he had hair all over his body, including his hands. His face was often set in a frown, with a clamped, determined mouth. But he had very white teeth when he gave off one of his rare, enormous smiles. He had difficulty handling a razor, sharpening a pencil, or dancing in time. He inhabited extremes, too much vigor and aggression, alternating with absent-mindedness and depression. But even at his most offensive, friends and family found in him something inexpressibly touching and noble, which always drew them back in. We generally divide Beethoven's life into 3 periods. The first period covers Beethoven's birth in Bonn, his difficult childhood, his move to Vienna and the early Viennese years, and the onset and confirmation of his hearing loss. At the age of 31, Beethoven was on the verge of suicide. In an unsent letter to his brothers, he lamented his increasing deafness, but vowed that he would continue to live for his art, despite his despair and loneliness. The second period is called the heroic period. Beethoven's powerful will transformed and expanded every genre. His creativity was given extra thrust by the political and cultural aspirations of the time, Napoleon's triumphs, the late phase of the Enlightenment, and the rise of the middle class. On a personal level, Beethoven was active in Viennese society despite his increasing deafness. He tried repeatedly to find a wife. When he was 42, he had a passionate encounter with a woman he loved who said she wanted to live with him. The letter he wrote to this woman, his immortal beloved, was never sent, but it revealed his ambivalent feelings about commitment and marked the end of his hope for marriage. There followed a difficult period of social withdrawal that culminated in Beethoven's late style. With 10 years left to live, he was totally deaf, but his late-style compositions explored the whole range of human experience in a language that was completely his own. Now that you have this 3-part overview, we can move through Beethoven's life chronologically and hear some of the music. For hundreds of years, members of the Beethoven family were bakers in the northern part of Belgium. The Flemish name Van Beethoven means of the beet farm. In about 1720, one of these Beethovens demonstrated such outstanding musical ability that the Prince of the Rhineland at Bonn brought him to Germany. This was Beethoven's grandfather, whose name could be Louis, Luigi, or Ludwig, depending on the language you spoke. Ludwig rose to the top of his profession and eventually controlled much of the musical activity in Bonn. He also developed a profitable Rhine wine business. His grandson, our Beethoven, hung this very portrait of his much-admired grandfather in every one of his residences. Unfortunately, this first Ludwig van Beethoven set in motion many dysfunctional qualities that plagued the next generations. The success of his wine business led to a history of alcohol abuse. The domineering grandfather weakened his only child, Johann van Beethoven, who would become Beethoven's father. The grandfather was a misogynist, driving his wife into a mental hospital and forbidding women to enter his house. His son, Johann, lived like a domestic servant, and when he became a court musician, he wasn't successful. His lack of confidence and discipline, and later his alcoholism, brought disgrace to the family. Johann's wife, Beethoven's mother, was already a widow when she married Johann. Maria Magdalena Keverich was rejected by her powerful father-in-law. It was said that she rarely laughed. She had little energy left for her 3 sons after coping with the problems of her husband. This picture shows the house where Beethoven was born and spent most of his childhood. The neighbors who shared the compound where they lived all remembered the weeping child at his piano. As soon as young Ludwig's musical talent became evident, his father cruelly drove him to excessive practicing, hoping the boy would become a famous child prodigy like the well-known Mozart. Johann woke his son in the middle of the night and made him work till dawn. He locked him in the cellar and beat him when he improvised or displayed any sign of originality. At school, Ludwig was dirty, shabbily dressed, and unable to make friends or learn math. He survived this first decade of his life by escaping into dreams and fantasies. At times, he was completely unreachable. From the age of 10, Beethoven studied with his principal keyboard teacher and mentor, Christian Neefe. Neefe had come from Leipzig with an impressive background in the music of J.S. Bach and Bach's sons. Beethoven learned all of Bach's 48 preludes and fugues, which revealed to him a sophistication and depth far beyond anything that was going on in Bonn. Neefe was also enthusiastic about literature and philosophy. He encouraged these interests in Beethoven. The musical life of Bonn soon provided Beethoven with abundant opportunities to develop his gifts. He became the assistant court organist and was keyboard player for the opera orchestra, playing many of Mozart's operas. As a violist, he played every day with the concert orchestra. He sat in the middle of the ensemble with his perfect pitch and his ear for timbre. He developed a sense of the architecture of orchestral sound. He was now surrounded by musicians who encouraged his remarkable talent for improvisation. He became confident of his musical imagination. Despite his uneven early education, Beethoven at 15 began attending classes at Bonn's University. He was intellectually curious and enjoyed belonging to a like-minded group of young men. Beethoven's attendance at the university was sporadic, but he was exposed to the Enlightenment ideals of Kant and the plays and poetry of Schiller and Goethe. Beethoven's philosophical understanding was a popularized, sloganized version, but it had a lasting effect on him, particularly the emphasis on political liberty. He saw a copy of Schiller's Ode to Joy and resolved that someday he would set it to music. Kant's sense of human morality also appealed to Beethoven. Throughout his life, Beethoven's personal creed would be derived from Kant's 2 poles of existence, the starry sky above me and the moral law within me. In 1787, Bonn's Prince Maximilian Franz sent the 16-year-old Beethoven on a 450-mile journey to Vienna to study with Mozart. It was expected that when Beethoven returned, he'd bring glory to the Bonn music scene. Although there's no evidence that a meeting took place, it's believed that Beethoven heard Mozart play. Beethoven had only been in Vienna 2 weeks when he was called back to Bonn. His mother was dying from tuberculosis. After his mother died, Beethoven became responsible for his father and his 2 younger brothers, Caspar Karl and Nicholas Johann. The father had become a local buffoon, and Beethoven, at 19, petitioned the prince to make him legal head of the Beethoven family. Ludwig now received half of his father's retirement pension so that he could support himself and his brothers. Ludwig always spoke of his parents with an idealized tenderness, but later in his life he never tried to dispel the widespread rumor that his father wasn't really his father, a rumor which often arose to account for his greatness. In the early years of his career, Beethoven relied on his pianistic virtuosity and improvisational skills rather than on his compositions. Since the age of 14, he'd been taken in by the first of his many surrogate families. The head of this family was an aristocratic widow named Helene von Breuning. She mothered Beethoven when he came to the house to teach her children, and she had a silhouette made of his head. She helped him to speak and to dress properly. At her salon, she would laughingly explain away Beethoven's awkward moodiness, naming his unreachable states his raptus. Beethoven's first love was Helene von Breuning's daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor's younger brother, Stefan von Breuning, became a lifelong friend, as did Franz Wiegler, who ultimately married Eleanor. At the von Breuning salon, Beethoven caught the attention of Count Waldstein, a key figure in his future success. In 1790, there was an important change in the Habsburg leadership of the Holy Roman Empire. The Emperor, Joseph II, died in Vienna. He was one of Beethoven's childhood heroes, as well as Mozart's generous patron. Beethoven, despite his youth, was commissioned by the court at Bonn to write a cantata on the death of Joseph II. You're about to hear music by Beethoven at the age of 19. His intensely dramatic style is already recognizable as the chorus enters, singing, "Dead, he is dead." A few months later, Count Waldstein introduced young Beethoven to Joseph Haydn, who was passing through Bonn on a trip to London. Beethoven showed Haydn the score of his Joseph cantata, and before long, Beethoven was on his way back to Vienna. In the words of Count Waldstein, he would receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. Mozart had just died in December of 1791. News of the French Revolution was spreading quickly through Europe. The French monarchy had been destroyed. Marie Antoinette, a sister of Joseph II and Maximilian Franz, had been guillotined. The French were moving in on the Rhineland and Bonn. As Beethoven traveled to Vienna, he was in danger when his coach passed through French lines. Once he arrived safely in Vienna, Beethoven was impressed by exotic Turkish features like coffee houses and onion-shaped architectural domes. The city was densely populated. 4-story buildings and narrow streets made the summertime exodus a necessity. Fortunately, the parks and outlying suburbs offered Beethoven natural beauty for his compulsive need to walk. Vienna was also a very expensive city, and Beethoven struggled to equip himself with a piano, wigs, and clothes. He wanted to take dancing lessons to increase his social attractiveness. His financial situation would have been untenable, but a few months after he left Bonn, his father died, enabling Beethoven to receive a greater portion of his father's pension. Because of Beethoven's friendship with Count Waldstein, he found immediate entree into the same close-knit aristocracy that supported Mozart. At the center of this group was the famous Countess Thun. She married all of her daughters to passionate music lovers. Their names, Waldstein, Lichnowsky, Razumovsky, Lobkowitz, appear again and again as dedicatees of Beethoven's works and as important agents in his developing career. Beethoven was embraced by an educated elite and was soon a popular piano teacher for its daughters. Beethoven found a new surrogate family in Prince Karl Lichnowsky and his wife, Catherine. He lived in the Lichnowsky Palace for several years, and for the next 10 years, he received their abundant financial and emotional support. At the salons, Beethoven was a thrilling performer with tremendous power and emotional impact. But many of Beethoven's patrons were disturbed by his quirky, unexpected modulations, the withholding of cadences, and the extreme dynamic contrasts. They preferred pleasure and predictability. Beethoven's reputation as a willful revolutionary grew with his fame. In this excerpt from the Piano Sonata Opus 7, you can hear the kind of emotional excesses that disturbed Beethoven's drawing room audiences. Beethoven could also be eager to please. Here's an excerpt from the Trio Opus 11, which he shrewdly dedicated to Countess Thun. The newly invented clarinet was still a novelty in Vienna, and for the final movement, Beethoven wrote a set of witty variations based on this latest operatic hit. Beethoven's relationship with Haydn, his supposed teacher, was complicated. He respected Haydn as the creator of the string quartet and the symphony, but the two composers didn't always connect on a personal level. Fortunately, Haydn was easygoing and indulgent. He referred to the intense Beethoven as our great mogul from Bonn. He overlooked Beethoven's many clumsy dishonesties and slights. Haydn, like Beethoven's other teachers, emphasized the work of the great Baroque masters, which enabled Beethoven to harness his wild musical imagination. His education was now complete. In 1800, Beethoven presented his first major concert in Vienna. A highlight was his septet, Opus 20, which became so popular that Beethoven became annoyed by the constant requests that he write more of such pleasurable music. In this same concert, Beethoven's first symphony was performed, along with one of the long and thrilling solo improvisations that left his audience gasping. Beethoven liked the term unbuttoned, which was often used in contemporary Vienna to describe the new and less formal men's fashion. He liked to describe his music as emotionally unbuttoned. Both of Beethoven's brothers had by now moved to Vienna, and Caspar Karl reported that while Beethoven was always in love, Josephine Brunswick was a special favorite. Beethoven had become attached to a new surrogate family, the aristocratic Brunswicks, who owned an enormous estate in Hungary, but were currently in Vienna looking for suitable husbands for Therese and Josephine. The young countesses were 24 and 20, and soon Beethoven was a welcome guest at their home. Beethoven was painfully disappointed when Josephine allowed herself to be married to Count Joseph Dame. Her marriage brought her an immense mansion where many of Beethoven's chamber music evenings were now held, often with the talented Josephine at the keyboard. Another regular performer at Josephine's salon was the great violinist Ignaz Schuppanzig. Schuppanzig became the leader of the world's first professional string quartet, which premiered almost all of Beethoven's works in that genre. Beethoven's amorous attention now wandered to Giulietta Guicciardi. She was Josephine's Italian cousin, a 16-year-old countess who became the dedicatee of the Moonlight Sonata. No one had ever opened a piano sonata with such improvisatory, intimate music. Beethoven was experimenting with alternatives to the traditional first movement, but the sonata's nickname, Moonlight, was the invention of music publishers, not the composer. Beethoven was again disappointed when Countess Julieta married a different composer, one who also happened to be a count. But worse than these romantic rejections was his growing anxiety about the humming and buzzing in his ears. He frantically sought medical help, but the therapies, like pouring almond oil in his ears, only made matters worse. A few years earlier, Beethoven had experienced a severe case of typhus, an illness which could lead to gradual deterioration of the inner ear. He was also suffering from chronic digestive problems. His doctor recommended that he spend the summer in Heiligenstadt, a village north of Vienna on the Danube. For 5 months, Beethoven lived in near seclusion, considering suicide. If he could no longer hear music, how could he continue to have a career as a performer? How could he have normal relationships with people who had to yell in his ears? In the face of this devastating future, Beethoven decided to accept his fate. In an unsent letter from Heiligenstadt to his brothers, he expressed a renewed sense of his mission, which was strengthened by the certain knowledge of his musical genius. During his summer of mental anguish, Beethoven was living in a completely different world musically. As he wrote his Second Symphony, he confidently solidified the sound of his mature orchestral palette. Here's a bit of the witty and high-spirited last movement. The following spring, Beethoven presented another major concert of his work. It was held at the Theater an der Wien, where he was now living. The ambitious program included the Second Symphony, which he conducted, the Third Piano Concerto, where he was the soloist, and his oratorio, Christ on the Mount of Olives. Now Beethoven began work on his groundbreaking Third Symphony, the Eroica. He also was writing 2 revolutionary piano sonatas, the Waldstein and the Appassionata. He had plans for an opera. This superhuman outpouring of creativity would last for the next 8 years. He was 32, and he was going to seize fate by the throat. He no longer cared about hiding his deafness and experimented freely with ear trumpets. A source of inspiration at this time was the legendary Greek figure Prometheus. Prometheus stole fire from the gods in order to endow mankind with creativity as well as the humanizing gifts of the arts and sciences. Beethoven wrote a ballet and a set of piano variations on the legend of Prometheus. Here's one of the piano variations, which you'll recognize because it became the subject of the last movement of the Eroica. Prometheus the hero became identified in Beethoven's mind with Napoleon. Like everyone in Europe, Beethoven was in awe of Napoleon's accomplishments. But Beethoven also felt a strong personal identification. Napoleon was just a year older, and both men were small in stature. Like Beethoven, Napoleon had risen from obscurity to self-made greatness. Napoleon's colossal ambition and his sense of destiny were other qualities that Beethoven shared. Napoleon's France was the enemy of Austria, and Napoleon was disliked by the Viennese aristocracy. But Beethoven at this time was considering the possibility of a career move to Paris. He decided to risk his popularity in Vienna and let it be known that his Third Symphony would be named for Napoleon and was a portrait of Napoleon's character. But as you can see in this picture of the symphony's title page, Beethoven violently erased Napoleon's name, so violently that he left a hole in the page. Napoleon had begun his career as a champion of freedom and the common man. When he had himself crowned hereditary emperor of France, the outraged Beethoven retitled the Symphony Eroica to represent the heroic qualities that motivated Beethoven personally. What was truly heroic about this symphony was its formidable length and dramatic power. For the next 100 years, it would set the standard for a symphonic work. Here's one of the Eroica's most stunning passages, the piercing climax of the first movement's development section. The massive musical expanses and exalted rhetoric will show you how much Beethoven had changed the symphony since Mozart's death 10 years earlier. One evening in 1804, Beethoven entertained a few of his friends from Bonn. This portrait was painted by one of the guests soon afterwards. In a traditional formula, the 33-year-old Beethoven is holding a lyre and conducting with his other hand. For a while, Beethoven allowed the painter to keep this portrait, but now he asked to have it delivered to a lady who wished to keep it in her room. You'll remember this woman, Josephine Brunswick, who had married Count Dame. She was now 25, and since Count Dame's unexpected death, she was a widow with 4 children. During her marriage, Beethoven had remained Josephine's piano teacher, and he was close to her family. Josephine's impulsive nature and passion for music led to a volatile attraction, but Countess Josephine had to conceal whatever relationship there was. The class difference between them was an insurmountable obstacle to marriage. Josephine insisted that Beethoven remove the dedication to her of a recent love song. Beethoven dedicated the Appassionata piano sonata to Josephine's brother, even though he was a cellist, and he dedicated his next piano sonata to Josephine's sister. In the salons of Vienna, it was common gossip that the popular Andante Favori was Beethoven's love offering to Josephine. Meanwhile, the family of Josephine's deceased husband and her own family were becoming alarmed. They threatened Josephine that Viennese law would take her children from her if she married the commoner, Beethoven. When Beethoven was unwilling to back off, Josephine had to banish him from her house. Soon she left Vienna and through an unfortunate series of mishaps was unhappily married to Baron von Stackelberg of Estonia. She had 2 children with Stackelberg, who had a ruinous effect on her life and her fortune. There's heated disagreement among historians regarding Josephine's subsequent contact with Beethoven. She's one of the 2 women believed to be the unnamed immortal beloved in Beethoven's controversial letter of 1812. Beethoven's romantic ups and downs didn't distract him from work on his opera. Although the work was initially called Leonore, it's known today as Fidelio, the name of the final version. There would be 3 revisions over the course of 10 years. Beethoven's libretto was based on a true story from the French Revolution, in which a young wife, disguised as a boy named Fidelio, attempts to free her husband from political imprisonment. Beethoven was inspired by the themes of heroism and marital devotion, but the libretto had to be given a 17th century Spanish setting to avoid stirring up any pro-French sentiment. Napoleon was closing in on the city, causing paranoia throughout Vienna. There also were delays caused by censors who suspected that the work was critical of the government. In 1805, the long-awaited first performance of the opera was about to take place. Beethoven was plagued with intestinal distress and rehearsing madly when Napoleon entered the city with 15,000 men. Nearly all of Beethoven's aristocratic supporters had fled, and the opera opened to a half-empty house of French soldiers and unhappy Viennese music critics. It was the worst disappointment of his career. This is the scene where the imprisoned hero, Florestan, is reunited with his wife, Leonore, who has disguised herself as the boy, Fidelio. Beethoven's compositions stimulated mechanical advances in instruments and in instrumental technique. The piano was rapidly evolving in Europe and England. In Beethoven's unending search for the ideal instrument, he was continually in touch with piano builders and evaluating their latest instruments. There were also exciting developments in string writing. 3 new string quartets were commissioned by Count Razumovsky, the Russian ambassador to Vienna who'd married one of Countess Thun's daughters. Schuppanzig's quartet was in residence at Razumovsky's spectacular palace. The quartets were considered horribly difficult to play or to understand, but no one doubted their excellence. At Razumovsky's request, Beethoven based several of the movements on authentic Russian folk melodies, but the original music he wrote sounded far more ethnically Russian than the borrowed folk tunes. Throughout Beethoven's life, he tended to create works in contrasting pairs. Outgoing works like the 3rd, 5th, and 7th symphonies were followed by the more lyric and introspective 4th, 6th, and 8th symphonies. The contemplative 4th piano concerto was followed by the flamboyant Emperor concerto. Beethoven was 37 when he premiered the 4th piano concerto. The prodigious program also included the first performances of the 5th and 6th symphonies. The entire program was drastically unrehearsed, performed in a freezing, unheated hall, and was for the most part unappreciated. Sadly, it was to be Beethoven's last appearance as a concerto soloist. As Beethoven's creative genius soared, relationships with his fellow human beings began to deteriorate. He moved frequently, always finding fault with his surroundings. He fought against Caspar Karl's marriage to Johanna, who was pregnant with the baby who would be Beethoven's adored nephew, Karl. He was abusive to his oldest friends from Bonn. His Viennese patrons fared even worse. Beethoven threatened to break a chair over Prince Lichnowsky's head and smashed to smithereens his bust of Lichnowsky. He stood in the doorway of Prince Lobkowitz's palace yelling, "Lobkowitz is a jackass," to passers-by. Beethoven had never been obsequious with the aristocracy, but he was becoming arrogant and unpredictable. He reminded them that his nobility was self-created, not just an accident of birth. There would always be princes, but only one Beethoven. Despite the unpromising premiere of the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven's stature as a composer now began to attain a significance never accorded to any composer before or since. This phenomenon was initiated by the most famous music critic of the 19th century, E.T.A. Hoffmann. In 1810, Hoffmann wrote an influential review of the Fifth Symphony. Beethoven, at 39, was seen as a prophet, revealing the wonders of the universe to an audience overwhelmed by awe and terror as they listened to his music. The concert hall became a place to experience spiritual revelations. Here's the opening of the Fifth Symphony, the famous Fate Knocks at the Door. This eloquent outburst became the most famous fragment in classical music, with an unimaginable future as the source of wartime mottos, video games, and ringtones. Like its predecessor, the Eroica, the Fifth Symphony told a story that was completely comprehensible to the layman as well as to connoisseurs. Here's the exciting transition to the last movement, which crowned the work with a spirit of unparalleled optimism. The contrasting Sixth Symphony was a portrayal of a visit to the countryside. Beethoven himself named the work Pastoral Symphony, Recollections of Country Life. Many lovers of Beethoven find in this music the composer at his most buoyant and spiritually positive. The work provides a touching portrait of human beings in the natural setting that Beethoven adored. Beethoven was now revered by middle-class concert-goers as well as the older aristocracy. When he threatened to leave Vienna and become Kapellmeister to Napoleon's brother, a few wealthy noblemen got together to guarantee him a yearly income. Beethoven only had to remain in Vienna as he created his masterpieces. Unfortunately, as a result of Napoleon's victories, the emperor soon had to devalue the Austrian currency. This reduced the value of Beethoven's annuity, and he was again faced with chronic financial anxiety. Napoleon's second attack on Vienna caused further damage to Beethoven's ears, and his digestive problems were still severe. Nonetheless, at 40, he continued with what he called his marriage project, pursuing the 18-year-old Thérèse Malfatti. Beethoven wrote the famous piano piece, Für Elise, for Thérèse. The publisher of the score thought the handwritten dedication read Elise. Beethoven had become so drunk at the party where he intended to propose to Thérèse that he scribbled the dedication illegibly on her music. In the 3 years following the Sixth Symphony, Beethoven wrote his Seventh and Eighth Symphonies. The Seventh was in every way the equal of the Third and the Fifth. But rather than confronting hostile forces, this symphony was an exuberant acceptance of life and the world. It was characterized by unrestrained rhythmic vitality. Beethoven had studied the rhythmic modes of ancient Greek poetry, and he constructed each of the movements by obsessively repeating one of his chosen metric units. There's a festive mood with dancing and at times a state of intoxicated euphoria. The Eighth Symphony was the shortest of Beethoven's symphonies and featured a smaller orchestra. Beethoven was looking back over the history of the Viennese symphony and wanted to create his own witty and playful version of each of the traditional movements. The Eighth Symphony was a connoisseur's symphony, reveling in lots of musical in-joking. In this excerpt from the second movement, you'll hear some tongue-in-cheek gestures imitating comic opera. Beethoven was now a well-known cultural hero, and a young woman named Bettina Brentano was stalking him. In 1810, when she was just 23, she crept into Beethoven's studio unannounced. He was 40, nearly deaf, and playing the piano to himself. When he felt her hands on his shoulders, he bellowed, but when he saw her, he was disarmed, and they became friends. A month later, Bettina moved to Berlin and married a famous poet. But before she left town, she brought another young woman to meet Beethoven, her cousin by marriage, Antonia Brentano. Antonia is the second candidate in the endless speculation about the unnamed immortal beloved in Beethoven's letter of 1812. Antonia Birkenstock-Brentano, known to all as Toni, was the only daughter of a major Viennese art collector. After the tragic death of her mother on her 8th birthday, she grew up in her father's enormous mansion, wandering among the 2,000 engravings, antique urns, Chinese robes, telescopes, and maps. She studied poetry and music, and she was an expert guitarist. After a convent education, her father insisted that she marry a wealthy Frankfurt banker who was 15 years older. Toni respected her husband, Franz Brentano, and they had 4 children. But she was never happy living in Frankfurt, and her husband was always preoccupied with business. When Toni's father became ill, she and her family returned to Vienna to take care of him. After his death, she began to liquidate the valuable art collection. This is when Bettina Brentano brought her to Beethoven's studio. For many months, Beethoven and Toni's relationship showed no signs of romantic attachment, although she described him as even better as a person than as a composer. Toni had been devastated by her father's death and was often too depressed to receive guests, but Beethoven paid her a visit almost daily. He would come to the anteroom outside her bedroom, where he would improvise at the piano for hours. She wrote, "He communicated with me in his own language, saying everything and bringing comfort." Beethoven was most himself when he was improvising, creating what he called music from one heart to another. These healing visits led to a special understanding between Beethoven and Toni, which was enriched but also complicated by Beethoven's friendship with her husband and the children. The Brentanos became a new surrogate family for Beethoven. Toni's daughter, 9-year-old Maximiliana, was learning to play the piano, and Beethoven wrote a special trio for her. For Toni, he wrote a love song with a guitar accompaniment, the only time he ever wrote music for the guitar, which was Toni's instrument. In this rare recording with guitar, you'll hear the words which perfectly expressed Beethoven's quandary. "I would drink the tears from your loving eyes, but your tears cling to your cheek in fidelity when I would have them in lust. Now your pain is mine." Now we get to the circumstances of the famous letter to the immortal beloved, a document that was found in a hidden drawer of Beethoven's desk when he died 15 years later. The drawer also contained this miniature portrait of Toni. In the summer of 1812, Beethoven, Toni, and her family all left Vienna separately for their summer vacations, planning to reunite later in Carlsbad. On July 3rd, in Prague, Beethoven unexpectedly encountered and spent an impassioned interlude with a woman he knew well, who now confessed her desire to live with him. A few days later, he wrote the wildly vacillating and conflicted letter to his immortal beloved. "My angel, my all, my own self," he wrote, "I can only live with you completely or not at all." Despite his desperate protestations of love, Beethoven intended to leave matters to the gods rather than taking an active role himself. Perhaps they can arrange things so that she can live with him, but the indecision of the letter suggests Beethoven's growing awareness that living together was unrealistic. He never sent this letter, but in writing it he finally realized that his longing for a wife and children would never be fulfilled. In the academic world, there's been bitter conflict about the identity of the unnamed immortal beloved. In the 1970s, Maynard Solomon's detective work seemed conclusive in favor of Tony. She and Beethoven were definitely in Prague at the same time. But in recent years, scholars from the Josephine camp suggested a different theory. It's possible that Josephine traveled alone from Vienna to Prague at this very time, trying to escape from her miserable marriage. Perhaps it was Josephine that Beethoven accidentally encountered that July night. After decades of juicy biographical scholarship, it's still impossible to conclusively prove whether the woman was Tony or Josephine. The endless arguments only obscure the central issue, Beethoven's anguished need for commitment and the impossibility of finding it with either Tony or Josephine. There can be no doubt that Beethoven loved both women and that both of them returned his love. The temptation to live with either of them would have been powerful, but Beethoven himself was providing the obstacle. Several months after the immortal beloved affair, he wrote in his diary, "You're no longer a human being, not for yourself, only for others. Your only happiness can be in your art. God, give me strength to conquer myself. Nothing at all must fetter me to this life." Just as in the Heiligenstadt letter, Beethoven renewed his commitment to art, sacrificing his personal needs. Devastated by the emotional explosion of the summer of 1812, he entered a new phase of his life. He was 42 years old. Toni and her family moved back to Frankfurt, and Beethoven never saw them again. They maintained a warm friendship through letters, and there were dedications of important compositions. Josephine's battles with Stackelberg obsessed her, and she was never able to form a stable relationship with Beethoven. Many crises lay ahead for Josephine in her remaining years, and it's believed that Beethoven secretly sent money to help her. Bettina Brentano had arranged the only meeting that ever occurred between Goethe and Beethoven. It took place soon after the July fiasco. Goethe said, "His talent astounded me, but unfortunately he has an utterly untamed personality." Beethoven said, "Goethe delights in the court atmosphere far more than is becoming to a poet." Beethoven's misery led him to interfere in his youngest brother Johann's life, just as he'd interfered with Caspar Karl. He tried to derail Johann's plans to marry on the grounds that the woman already had an illegitimate daughter. For the rest of their lives, and despite Johann's financial and domestic success, Beethoven referred to this sister-in-law and niece as Fat Lump and the Bastard. When he returned to Vienna, Beethoven found distraction in political excitement. Napoleon had been defeated by Wellington. After 25 years of Parisian aggression, there could be a return to a peaceful, conservative Europe. Beethoven was persuaded by Johann Maelzel, the inventor of the metronome, to collaborate on an orchestral piece describing Wellington's victory. Maelzel's contribution was an instrument capable of creating the sound of cannons and gunfire on cue. Beethoven wrote 188 such cues in his complicated score. Here's an excerpt of the piece. Beethoven made a lot of money on the many Wellington performances and was named an honorary citizen of Vienna. The composition caused some Beethoven enthusiasts to think he was being ironic, parodying what the public wanted. But others point to his growing commitment to German rather than Austrian culture. He was studying Bach, Handel, counterpoint, and German folk songs. A newfound lyricism was creeping into his music. His late style was beginning to emerge. These years were a terrible time for Beethoven. At 44, his deafness had increased, and it became necessary to use a pencil and booklets of paper to communicate with him. These conversation books and his personal diary provide us with revealing insights into his daily life. He stopped taking care of himself. Visitors to his apartment found uneaten food and unemptied chamber pots. His finances and relationships with publishers were chaotic. His opera, in its final form, was an international sensation, but he seemed unable to produce any new work. The failure of his marriage project and the probability of dying alone and totally deaf drove Beethoven to exhibit the worst qualities of his grandfather, especially the fanatic resentment of his two sisters-in-law. Beethoven's disastrous obsession with his nephew, Karl, began in 1813, a few months after the conclusion of the Immortal Beloved affair. Beethoven's dying brother, Caspar Karl, had been deeply in debt when Beethoven loaned him money in return for the promise of custody of Karl, to the exclusion of the child's mother. The boy was 9 when his father died. Beethoven began to refer to Karl as his own son and insisted on total control of Karl's life. Simultaneously, he waged a relentless campaign to demonize the mother and prevent her from having any meaningful contact with her child. These are stories that no lover of Beethoven likes to think about, but there's no denying that ongoing custody battles are the background for the masterpieces of Beethoven's late style. There's a chilling contrast between Beethoven's obsessive delusions and the sublime, logical music he was writing. In the remaining 13 years of his life, Beethoven was never free of his agonizing need for Karl. The first masterpiece of Beethoven's late style was a song cycle for voice and piano, To the Distant Beloved. It revealed Beethoven's deeply felt acceptance that art would be his only reliable means of communication with the people he loved. There are 6 connected songs of absence, distance, and loneliness. This work became the model for the song cycles of Schubert and Schumann. In this excerpt, a beautiful landscape is described where the lover imagines he would sit with his beloved. The phrase, "If only I were there," is repeated again and again.
Wo die Berge so blau aus dem niedrigen Grau schauen herein, wo die Sonne verglüht, wo die Wolke umzieht, möchte ich sein, möchte ich sein. Dort im ruhigen Tal schweigen Schmerzen und Qual, wo im Gestein still die Priemel dort sind, wie zu leise der Wind, möchte ich sein, möchte ich sein. In zum sinnigen Wald drängt mich Liebesgewalt, innere Pein, innere Pein. Ach, mich zögst nicht von hier, könnt ich traute bei dir ewiglich sein. Ewiglich sein.
Beethoven was now suffering from the constant physical illness that would prevail until the end of his life. He began to look older than his 48 years, with jaundice, ulcerative colitis, lung inflammation, rapidly worsening eyesight, and deafness. It's incredible that he was now undertaking his most ambitious projects yet. It was always in relationship to the piano that Beethoven explored new territory. Opus 106, the Hammerklavier Sonata, was a breakthrough. Hammerklavier is the German name for the piano. It signaled Beethoven's intention to use the German words of his mother tongue rather than Italian for expressive directions in his scores. His musical imagination required epic dimensions to monumentalize what the Hammerklavier could do. It was a 40-minute sonata, including a grueling 12-minute closing fugue. It used the piano's most extreme ranges with wildly unpredictable musical language. Beethoven's late style continued to evolve in the trilogy of piano sonatas written in the early 1820s. Opus 109, 110, and 111 are each unique and can stand alone, but as a trilogy, they represent Beethoven's final pronouncement on the piano sonata. Each sonata moved away from the massive extroversion of the Hammerklavier toward explorations that were more intimate and introspective. In all the late sonatas, Beethoven altered the traditional 3 and 4 movement design. He also was transferring the expressive weight of the work to the final movement. Both Opus 109 and 111 conclude with extraordinary theme and variation movements. Beethoven's last major work for the piano was the Diabelli Variations. From a simple waltz tune by Diabelli, a vast musical panorama was created. In both the Diabelli Variations and the variation movements of the last sonatas, a progression of variations creates a trajectory which culminates in a new world of celestial perfection. In this excerpt, you'll hear the 2 final variations from the last piano sonata. Beethoven dedicated Opus 109 to Tony's 19-year-old daughter, Maximiliana. The dedication included a heartfelt letter expressing his love for your excellent spirited mother and your inspired father. Beethoven's final gift to Tony was the dedication of the Diabelli Variations, his greatest achievement in variation form. Biographers committed to Josephine Brunswick as Beethoven's immortal beloved believe that the last two sonatas are musical memorials for Josephine, who died in the year that the sonatas were written. Leaving behind the insoluble mystery of the immortal beloved, we turn to the outstanding last works of Beethoven's final years. In 1819, it had been announced that Beethoven's longtime student and patron, Archduke Rudolph, was going to be made an archbishop. Rudolph was the youngest brother of the emperor and had already received many important dedications: the fourth and fifth piano concertos, the Les Adieux Sonata, the Archduke Piano Trio, and the Hammerklavier Sonata. Now Beethoven began work on a great mass to celebrate the occasion of Archduke Rudolph's ordination. Beethoven eventually considered the work so important that he asked the Brentanos to commission this famous portrait of him holding the score. The artist also created a miniature of this painting for Tony. With the Missa Solemnis, Beethoven intended to make his own contribution to the legacy of Palestrina, Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart. Despite his lifelong resistance to organized religion, he was ready to explore his relationship to a creator deity, both the dogmatic Catholic conception and his own. 4 years later, Rudolph's inauguration ceremony was long past, but Beethoven had uncompromisingly completed what he now considered his greatest work. It was an encyclopedia of every known musical form and technique. It's been called a cathedral in sound. A live performance stretches to the limit what can be produced and communicated in music. Here's a passage from the Benedictus with its ethereal violin solo. Ten years had passed since Beethoven had written a symphony. At 52, he was concurrently writing his last 3 piano sonatas and the Missa Solemnis, but he was also overflowing with ideas for what would be his last public work, the Ninth Symphony. The esoteric spiritual world of the Missa Solemnis would be followed by Beethoven's thoroughly German and populist Kiss to the Whole World. Beethoven had been disappointed by the return of political tyranny in post-Napoleonic Vienna. Spies and repressive laws were keeping a lid on the idealism of students, artists, and the rising middle class. Beethoven hoped that his Ninth Symphony would revive the Enlightenment spirit. He'd been carrying Schiller's Ode to Joy with him for 30 years, and now he was ready to launch a message of hope to the future world. In the Ninth Symphony, 3 massive instrumental movements set the stage for the immense final cantata on Schiller's Ode to Joy with its solo voices and chorus. In the first 3 movements, Beethoven returned to forms he'd explored in his earlier symphonies, but with even more terrifying power and passionate lyricism. As a transition to the last movement, there's a dramatic sequence in which all the ravishing music of the first hour of the symphony is rejected. Then, from a simple tune that took Beethoven a lifetime to perfect, a visionary new world emerges. In this last movement, 2 musical ideas are ultimately united in a great double fugue. The first idea, with its Dionysian energy, celebrates the pleasures of earthly life, personified by Joy, the daughter of Elysium. In the second idea, the ecstatic millions are embraced and urged to look out at the starry sky where Beethoven believed a dear father must surely dwell. The experience of Viennese concertgoers at the premiere of the Ninth Symphony was overwhelming. Tumultuous demonstrations and applause interrupted the music several times. Beethoven wasn't able to conduct, but he stood next to the conductor with his score, indicating the tempos with his arms. He watched the musicians and listened with his eyes. He was totally deaf and had to be turned by the sleeve of his coat to face the ecstatic audience and receive their thanks. It was his last public appearance. Beethoven could have continued with public works. There were plans for a 10th symphony or a second opera, but instead he turned inward, returning to the world of the string quartet, where he created what many consider to be the pinnacle of Western classical music. Each of the 5 quartets rewards the listener with nuances of human experience rarely, if ever, communicated. Beethoven was completely possessed by his work, wandering the streets in shocking disarray, scaring animals, and gesticulating wildly with his arms as he composed. He was arrested several times. There were no non-musical pleasures in his life other than an occasional pipe and lots of fortified wine. His lifelong colleague, the violinist Schuppanzig, had introduced Beethoven to yet another wealthy Russian, Prince Nikolai Golitsyn. Golitsyn asked Beethoven to write him 3 new string quartets for whatever price Beethoven wished. The down payment was sufficient to relieve Beethoven's endless financial anxieties and his desire to leave money for Karl. As he completed the E-flat, the A minor, and the B-flat quartet with its colossal fugue, each was performed by Schuppanzig's quartet. After he'd completed the Golitsyn commission, Beethoven wrote a final pair of quartets, the C-sharp minor and the F major. The C-sharp minor is one of Beethoven's most tragic and searching compositions. Opening a quartet with a fugue was unprecedented, but fugal writing had become essential for Beethoven. Beethoven had just finished his C-sharp minor quartet when his jealousy and unbearable possessiveness drove his 19-year-old nephew Karl to purchase 2 pistols and fire both of them at his own head. Miraculously, he survived, and at his request was returned to his mother's house. A month later, Beethoven spent some time with Karl at his brother Johann's country house. Beethoven had become resigned to Karl's independence and his determination to have a military career. Chastened and heartbroken, Beethoven's response was to write the most comic of his quartets, the F major. It concludes with rhythmic repetitions of Beethoven's exuberant and ironic affirmation, notated in German on the score. It must be. It must be. When it was time to return to Vienna, Beethoven refused to ride in the family carriage with his sister-in-law. He and Karl made the trip in a farmer's open wagon in the rain. During the 2-day trip, he developed pneumonia. Back in Vienna, he hung on for a few more months, suffering horribly from innumerable maladies, including cirrhosis of the liver. He thought of Bonn and craved Rhine wine, which arrived too late for him to taste. His edema was so bad that they drained more than 25 pounds of liquid from his abdomen. Worst of all was his despair when Karl left Vienna to join his military regiment. Beethoven had been in a coma lasting several days when there was a violent spring snowstorm. Responding to a ferocious burst of lightning and thunder, Beethoven momentarily regained consciousness, sat up and raised his fist, but then fell back dead. It was March 26, 1827. 3 days later, the city of Vienna gathered to honor Beethoven. The schools were closed, and a military presence had to manage the crowds. More than 10,000 people followed Beethoven's coffin from his home to the church and then to the graveyard. Throughout his life, Beethoven had tried to heal himself and the wider world with his art. Music describing the highest aspirations of humanity replaced his tragic family circumstances, his illnesses, and his unreturned loves. At the end of his life, facing forces of complete disintegration, he created music of wholeness and fulfillment. He sent an ecstatic kiss to all of humanity, presenting us with a musical world of superhuman glory, from his heart to ours.
Wenn das Dämmerungsrot dann zieht, nach dem stillen blauen See und sein letzter Strahl verglüht hinter jene Berges was mir aus